see how that plays out in the courts. But as for policy changes, federal lawmakers regularly introduce bills that aim to crack down on various aspects of patent gaming. But those haven't gained much traction so far, and there are lots of reasons for that. The industry lobbies hard against regulation. But another consideration is that policymakers are worried about interfering with the system that we have set up. A system that, in a lot of cases, has been extraordinarily successful at producing breakthrough therapies. And I think this is what is so hard about regulating the pharmaceutical industry. We want to strike a balance between the benefits the system brings and the ways that it can sometimes harm patients. We don't want to create incentives that discourage companies from coming up with breakthrough therapies. We want to create the space where companies will take the risks to bring the next Truvada to market. But we also don't want to have a system where companies prioritize profits over patients, where safer medications get delayed for business reasons and patients suffer. We want to discourage companies from gaming the system.
Rebecca, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. Here's what else you should know today. The Biden administration announced it would prohibit drilling in 13 million acres of the National Petroleum Reserve and cancel all existing leases in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It was Biden's most aggressive move yet to protect millions of acres of pristine Alaskan wilderness from oil and gas exploration. But it would not stop the enormous Willow oil drilling project in the same vicinity that Biden approved earlier this year and that climate activists oppose. And the special counsel investigating Hunter Biden said on Wednesday that he planned to indict the president's son on a gun charge before the end of the month. In a 3-page update filed in federal court in Wilmington, Delaware, David Weiss laid out plans to bring charges related to Biden's purchase of a pistol in 2018, when prosecutors say he lied on a federal form by stating that he was not using drugs at the time. The move was prompted by the acrimonious collapse of a plea deal between Biden and federal prosecutors in July. Today's episode was produced by Eric Krumke and Will Reed. It was edited by Liz O'Balin and Paige Cowett. Fact-checked by Nicole Pasalka and Susan Lee. Contains original music by Rowan Nimisto, Dan Powell, Alicia Benito, and Marian Lozano, and was engineered by Alyssa Moxley. Our theme music is by Jim Brunberg and Ben Landsberg of Wonderly. Special thanks to Cheryl Stolberg. That's it for the Daily. I'm Sabrina Tavernisi. See you tomorrow.
Today's episode is sponsored by Chevron.
Good morning. Welcome to Axios Today. It's Thursday, September 7th. I'm Nyla Boodoo. Today, a new era for Airbnb, plus the latest from Ukraine, including Blinken's surprise visit to Kyiv, and our one big thing, Maui's new message to tourists. At least 17 people were killed and dozens injured yesterday by a Russian missile at a Ukrainian market in the eastern part of the country. It's the deadliest attack in Ukraine in months. And it all happened the same day U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken made a surprise visit to Kyiv.
We will continue to stand by Ukraine's side, and today we're announcing new assistance totaling more than $1 billion in this common effort.
That's Blinken at a joint news conference yesterday with Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba. Blinken says the new aid will support the military's long-term needs and help fund equipment to clear Russian landmines. Ukraine is now the world's most heavily mined country, with about 30% of its land contaminated. Blinken also met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky yesterday. This is his fourth visit to Ukraine since the war began. It's been about a month since the Lahaina wildfire broke out on Maui, and now the local community is facing another hardship, a severe economic downturn. Most of Hawaii's residents depend on tourism to pay the bills, but there's been a drop in travel, and it's costing the entire state $9 million a day. That's according to the Hawaii Tourism Authority. So now the local government has a new message for tourists. Axios' Sarah Gu is here with what they have to say. Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
Sarah, what's Hawaii's new message to tourists?
Come back, or come visit Maui, come visit Hawaii. It's, I think, a bit of a unique message that they're trying to pivot to, because as you remember, when the fires broke out, it was a real emergency and they needed to get tourists home. They needed to get people out of a dangerous situation. They needed to grieve. They needed to find victims of the fire, and that's, of course, taken weeks to do. But at the same time that they're dealing with this, I think they're realizing that they are incredibly dependent on tourism for their economy. So it's really hard to be grieving and trying to find housing while also not then having a job, right? Because either the businesses are slowing down, there's not enough people in the restaurants, in the hotels, at the airport. So that tends to affect nearly everyone on the island who has some connection, either directly or indirectly, from the tourism economy.
And speaking of connections, you have a deep connection to Hawaii. How is your family?
Oh, thanks for asking. I do. I have a lot of family there. My grandmother's from there. My cousins live there. Thankfully, they're safe and their homes were safe, although it looked very dodgy for a while. But some of them work in the tourism business. Everyone knows someone who did die in the fire. They've been going to funerals lately. So they're really reeling from all of this in many ways at the same time.
Given all of that, what are ways people can be respectful tourists in Maui?
Right, and that's the other message is come visit, but be respectful. They don't want tourists to go to the affected areas. They don't want people taking selfies in front of the ashes. How terrible would that be? And a lot of people who are displaced by the fire are living in some hotels in the Lahaina area, so they're able to repurpose the shelter that they do have from the tourism industry in that part of the island. So they've literally printed a map and said, come to this area, but not this area of the island on Maui. So the bottom line is the west side of Maui is closed and the rest of Maui is open, and they would love to have tourists who are respectful. And chatter I've seen on Facebook in particular where there's people looking to go visit Maui have asked locals, where should I go? Where can I buy goods from a local business? Where can I volunteer? And a lot of people are doing that. You see videos of them going to Costco and dropping off a donation right off of getting off a plane before they head to, their vacation spot. And I think that's really welcome. And I think that this is yet another major disaster. I would put the pandemic first and that most recently that have, given rise to these conversations about, as we rebuild, how do we want to do that honors both our history, our traditions, supports truly local people, and also finds a balance in welcoming people.
Sarah Gu is Axios' editor-in-chief. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
In a moment, why new Airbnb rules could go beyond New York City.
Chevron is working to responsibly meet rising energy demand across their U.S. operations, like at their Gulf of Mexico facility, which are some of the world's lowest carbon intensity operations, helping supply energy that's affordable, reliable, and ever cleaner. That's energy in progress. Learn more at chevron.com/meeting demand.
Welcome back to Axios Today. I'm Nyla Boydu. New York City is cracking down on short-term rentals like Airbnb and Vrbo. And since the announcement earlier this week, some are calling this essentially the end of Airbnb as we know it. Under these new rules, short-term stays must be registered with the city or face up to $5,000 in fines. So can these type of rentals survive in New York? And will we start seeing this across the country? Axios' Alex Fitzpatrick has been covering this. Hi, Alex.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Alex, why is New York City making this move?
Well, the rules themselves aren't really new. It's the registration that's new, and it's to enforce long-standing rules that were just never really enforced across New York City about short-term housing. And those rules include you're not really supposed to list a rental for fewer than 30 days. There's a maximum of 2 guests, and the host should be sort of on the property. You know, and one other noteworthy thing is that the hosts and visitors have to leave the doors unlocked so people can access the entire place while you're there. And people just don't want that. Most people don't want their host, when they're staying in an Airbnb, to be able to wander in and out of their property or the bedroom where they're staying, right?
So this move, or this enforcement, is expected to dramatically reduce the list of available short-term rentals in New York City?
Yeah, that's right. Airbnb has said that they've got nearly 15,000 hosts across New York City. But as of the end of August, the city's only approved 257 permits out of about 3,250 applications. So you're going to see a lot fewer Airbnb listings in New York City basically immediately.
Alex, are there people who are happy about this move because they've been unhappy about Airbnb's effect on the housing industry across New York?
Yeah, critics of short-term rentals say that because landlords are essentially renting or listing their rooms and apartments on Airbnb and other platforms instead of renting them out to locals, it's effectively decreasing the supply of housing for locals and increasing the price.
And do we expect that other cities will follow New York City's lead on this?
They certainly could. I think many will wait and see what happens in New York City's tourism industry. Airbnb has warned that this move stands to curtail the city's tourism income. Whether that happens is, a little bit questionable. So I think many are sort of waiting to see. A lot of cities have, in recent years, tried to take new steps to regulate Airbnb. Just a few months ago, New Orleans issued a bunch of new restrictions of its own. It's not just Airbnb, it's, Vrbo and Booking and all sorts of other platforms as well.
Alex Fitzpatrick edits Axios' What's Next newsletter. Thanks, Alex.
Sure.
Before we go today, as promised, our team is sharing our summer reading recommendations as we hang on to summer for a bit longer.
Hey, this is Alex here, the sound engineer and producer here at Axios today. A couple books I'd like to recommend for our listeners are Bob Dylan's The Philosophy of Modern Song and Lee Kiesling's Mobility. While not great beach reads since they're both hardcovers, I think they give 2 different ways of looking into the kind of dizzying nuance required to live in these times. So check them out.
Hi, I'm one of the producers, Robin Hood. This summer I read the latest in the Thursday Murder Club series. So his main characters live in a peaceful English retirement village, and instead of a weekly book club, they get together to talk about historic unsolved murders. And then of course they actually have to solve a murder. It's a cute concept, but really it's the funny writing and totally spot-on dialogue that makes this such a good read.
Hi, this is Alexandra Montine. I'm the supervising producer of Axios Today, and I really enjoyed listening to the audiobook of The Verifiers by Jane Peck. It follows a young woman who gets a job at kind of an online dating detective agency where she susses out the truth about people online and gets caught up in a missing persons case. I really loved following that main character on her bike rides around New York as she investigated, and there's a really lovely and sometimes hilarious immigrant family story at the heart of the book as well.
My name is Lydia McMillan-Laird, and I'm a producer for Axios Today. This summer I've been really enjoying reading short stories. The last short story I read is called The Great Silence by Ted Chiang. It's a really poignant, funny, and heartbreaking story about outer space and human language, told from the point of view of a parrot of all things. I really think short stories are the underrated smart gravity novel, and I recommend them to anyone, especially if you don't have a lot of time to read.
My last summer read is something that Rebecca Mackay just recommended, romantic comedy by Curtis Sittenfeld, and I've loved all of her books. This one is such a great summer read because it's a love story, but it's also a really messy love story, which I find kind of inspiring. I am going to be starting my fall reading with The Covenant of Water, which was an Oprah Book Club selection, but I am really interested in this because it is set in Kerala, which is where my ancestors are from, and it's an epic that spans from 1900 to 1977. Happy reading!
Stall or completely derail any policy coming out of the Biden administration. And I should point out that judge shopping, which is basically looking around for a court with an ideologically favorable judge to file your case with, is not new. A lot of people do that.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Charles Schwab. Independent registered investment advisors are fiduciaries. They must act in your best interest always. That's why Schwab is proud to support them. Visit findyourindependengadvisor.com.
Hi, this is Steph.
And Amos.
And we're sitting on our back porch enjoying a glass of wine after putting our newborn son to sleep. This podcast was recorded at
2:09 p.m. on September 7th, 2023.
Things may have changed by the time you hear this, but hopefully our little one will sleep peacefully through the night. Okay, here's the show.
I imagine sleeping peacefully, not a thing that happens too frequently at that stage.
Not as I recall. And I don't recall much from that stage because I was not sleeping.
You just kind of blacked out for a ways.
Yeah, or a few years.
Hey there, it's the NPR Politics Podcast. I'm Miles Parks, I cover voting.
I'm Ashley Lopez, I cover politics.
And I'm Sarah McCammon, I also cover politics.
And today we are checking in on the Republican primary field. It's been 2 weeks since the first debate, and the non-Donald Trump candidates are working to carve out their lanes in this race. At this point, there are multiple campaign events all across the country happening every day. I want to start with my home state, Florida, where Governor Ron DeSantis' campaign has been struggling, specifically with staff turnover. Ashley, you've been reporting on this. What can you tell us?
What's important and kind of obvious to say about Ron DeSantis right now is that his campaign has started really rocky, and it's just not getting any better. For those who remember, it kind of got off to a rocky start with that disastrous announcement on Twitter Live that had all of those technical issues. And since then, there's been a lot of turnover, including his campaign manager, which is a pretty big deal mid-campaign. And I've talked to a lot of people who've worked on presidential campaigns before, and they say they've seen some pretty run-of-the-mill pitfalls, like him losing to his record as a governor. But all the chaos in his campaign means that things are just not going well. It's hard for him to get his message out, because if you don't have some basic infrastructure things going right, it's hard to see a campaign going really far.
Do the people you talk to feel like running a presidential campaign and running a campaign for governor in a pretty big state, are those two really different operations, or are they fairly similar?
Yeah, so I talked to a pollster who worked on DeSantis' 2018 gubernatorial campaign, and he's also worked on big presidential campaigns with his firm, and he said there's a huge learning curve.
Our first presidential candidate was fond of saying that going from a statewide race to a presidential contest was like going from 8th grade basketball to the NBA finals.
To give him some credit, it's really, there's nothing that prepares you for running on a national stage like this. You just have to get good at it over time. So, but of course, it helps to have people who you trust and and it seems like Ron DeSantis just doesn't have that, because he's just had so much staff turnover, not just within his campaign, but he hasn't kept a lot of staff from campaign to campaign. I mean, Whittear's told me that he hasn't been hired back, and a lot of the people he's worked with weren't hired back. So it's kind of a tricky situation that the DeSantis campaign is right now.
Well, Sarah, you went to a number of campaign events for former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley. Have you seen parallels between her campaign and some of the pitfalls of the DeSantis campaign?
Well, I think Haley, she's certainly been leaning into her record as a governor, and at least in the audience I saw yesterday in New Hampshire, she seemed to be doing that successfully. I mean, she talks a lot about her work. This was an education-focused event. She talked about her work on education reform in the state of South Carolina. She brings to the table both credentials as a former executive, as a governor, and as a former UN ambassador, so she has that international experience, and that's something she's been touting heavily. I mean, I think she was a very different governor than DeSantis, with very different politics, and she was governing at a time when the state was, I think she was widely viewed as very successfully navigating some huge challenges. South Carolina went through that horrible shooting in Charleston, and Nikki Haley, made a big point of getting rid of the Confederate flag over the State House. And so, it's hard to compare the two, but I think what they both have in common is, no surprise they're running on those executive credentials and trying to sort of sell them to the voters.
To you both, do we have any sense on how much the debate a couple of weeks ago
Nikki Haley, but I talked to several folks who were specifically brought up the debate. They said they were impressed with her performance. They thought she really shone on the debate stage. I talked to a couple of friends who came together, Judith Malloy from Hopkinton, New Hampshire, and her friend Marsha Moran from Concord, New Hampshire. And here's what Judith said.
You know, I really was so very impressed by her debate. You know, her demeanor, she held her own, and I think she can play well, you know, among the candidates, and I think she has a chance of winning.
And, you know, her friend Marsha said that initially she was worried that Haley had been out of the executive office and out of the ambassadorship for too long and would be kind of rusty. But she said ever since she launched her campaign earlier this year, up to the debate, she's been impressed with her and sees her as somebody who will be by.
I think the classic problem that like Nikki Haley and DeSantis and all these folks are running into is that there are a lot of people, like a lot of candidates going after sort of the same lane. I've talked to some people in Republican politics who are, you know, really smart about this stuff, and they say there continues to be about like 3 buckets of Republican voters. We're talking about always Trump voters who are going to vote for Trump no matter what, you know, if he's a candidate in the election. And then there are maybe Trumpers, you know, people who voted for Trump in the past but are open to an alternative. And then there's never Trumpers. These are the people who never voted for Trump in the past elections or, you know, even the most recent one, and want to have a different Republican option. Obviously, like Chris Christie and folks like that are very keyed into the never Trump sector of the Republican Party, but everyone else is sort of like trying to hit this maybe Trump lane, and it's really hard, and they all have to sort of like, you know, stand out in a field of a lot of people trying to stand in that lane. So, you know, things like a debate and also just like having a lot of visibility is something that they're all fighting for, and even having a semi-okay or a kind of, you know, mostly okay performance in things like a debate, it's hard to see how that's going to like elevate them to the front of a very busy street, not to like belabor that metaphor.
No, it's interesting to hear Haley on that. She talks about her experience, her record as a UN ambassador. She doesn't talk a whole lot about Trump. I mean, she seems to really be kind of trying to be in that middle ground where she doesn't want to alienate Trump voters, but she wants to be an alternative for people who are looking for something else.
Well, and specifically on the issue of abortion, I remember that clip from the debate where she seems to be trying to carve out, am I correct in characterizing this, Sarah, kind of a more moderate position on abortion than maybe the majority of the other people standing on the stage?
Moderate within the Republican primary.
Exactly.
I mean, I think it's always important to point out that you know, at least 60%, 70% of American voters think abortion should be legal in all or most cases in poll after poll. So when we're talking about a moderate Republican, we're talking about a moderate Republican. But yes, within the primary slate, Haley has been very cautious and I think strategic about what she said about abortion. While you have people like former Vice President Mike Pence calling on all of his Republican rivals to take a position in favor of a national abortion ban after 15 weeks, something that isn't likely to happen because of in Congress, but nonetheless, that's a position he staked out. Haley, meanwhile, has said, look, that's not realistic. Republicans don't have the votes. She's right about that, but that also, probably not coincidentally, is a position that's likely to be much safer for a general election audience were she ever to make it, you know, that far.
Actually, turning back to DeSantis for just a second here, I'm curious about early on in his campaign, it seems like the unspoken message was, I am Trump without the baggage, right? I am kind of able to tap into a lot of the things that he tapped into, but I don't have, you know, multiple indictments next year. How effective has that idea kind of been for him, considering the campaign is struggling?
Yeah, I mean, it's your classic electability pitch. Like, he's trying to be the candidate that appeals to the voters who are like, oh, we like Trump, but can he win a general election? And, you know, if you have a campaign that can't even make it through, like, the summer with the same people running it and, you know, having all this, like, press about turnover and chaos, like, is your electability argument all that strong? It's an open question, and I think, like, that's why other candidates seem to be creating a little bit more ground for themselves, because, you know, the people who are looking for an electable candidate probably want to, like, at least a more, you know, together kind of campaign.
Okay, let's take a quick break, and when we get back, we're going to talk about Mike Pence.
Support for NPR and the following message comes from United, the first airline to commit to achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 without relying on traditional carbon offsets. United has invested in the future production of more than 5 billion gallons of sustainable aviation fuel, more than any other airline. Learn more at united.com/sustainability story, based on publicly announced airline offtake agreements for future purchases of SAF. This message comes from NPR sponsor Organic Valley, a co-op of small organic family farms. Farmer Tyler Webb shares what being a steward of his land means to him.
When I think of land stewardship, it's taking the opportunity to slowly walk through your farm, to listen, to look for ways to work in harmony with our environment, with our ecosystem.
Discover Organic Valley Dairy at ov.coop/ethically sourced.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Mimecast. When an email address is the direct digital path to the mind and data of your organization, you're at risk. But advanced email security from Mimecast can put your mind at ease. Visit mimecast.com today to start your free 30-day trial.
And we're back. And this week, former Vice President Mike Pence made his pitch for the nomination, arguing that the Republican Party should return to its traditional conservative values.
So today I ask my fellow Republicans this. In the days to come, will we be the party of conservatism? Or will we follow the siren song of populism, unmoored to conservative principles?
Sarah, you were at that speech in New Hampshire. Tell us more about the Pence pitch.
Yeah, so, big picture here. Pence, like everybody else in the primary, is struggling to catch up to Donald Trump, struggling to come up with a message that sets him apart. And he's been very careful about how he's talked about his former boss. We've seen him defend his own behavior on January 6th, while also saying at the Milwaukee debate, the first Republican debate in Milwaukee a couple weeks ago, that he would support Trump as the party's nominee if he's the eventual nominee, even if he's convicted in a court of law. So I think what was interesting about this speech is, as we heard, Pence was really taking on his former boss in a more direct way. And he was doing it by trying to contrast Trumpist populism with traditional Reaganite conservatism. And he defined that in a couple of different ways. He talked about essentially a willingness to abandon constitutional principles, which was a clear allusion to his former boss. He talked about isolationism, and here he was taking jabs not just at Trump, but at I think some of the other Republican rivals, perhaps Vivek Ramaswamy and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who've talked about cutting funding to Ukraine. And he painted a picture of the Republican